Although I have to set everything up usually.
I feel like if I were a professor, I would go in there at night, say I was like holding a night study thing, and just project a bunch of movies in there, and just binge watch movies.
Well, that's what I'm going to do for the last session. I'm going to play a movie. I'll bring like 5 or 6, and then whoever shows up, same thing here.
Yeah.
I will bring a movie and probably the same 6 movies.
So we have class on Tuesday and Thursday next week?
No, we have one session on Tuesday. And we meet at the same time, but it's a double session. So I could bring a movie and we'll have time to watch the whole movie.
So it goes till
and
2
discuss
or till 4?
3:45.
3:45.
Yeah,
It's a double session, which is why we only meet once that week, because the other class that would be at about the same time and meet in the same place will have it for the other day for that same double session. So, and the reason for it is a lot of classes will give you a decimating 2-hour-long final that summarizes everything you had to memorize throughout the entire course, so that they could fail you at the very end. You know.
One of my friends, her only grade in her class is her final. I can't imagine
That's the British. That's the British method. You don't even get any grading opportunities until the test.
I feel like that's why British people are famously like really sort of like pessimistic and callous, because they've seen it all.
I think it has the weather to do. The weather in the British Isles is.
It's the water.
Or it's the aristocracy, because they know that there's no like social mobility, so they don't even.
That's a myth. That's
caring.
a myth.
Is it actually?
Yeah. In fact, the
myth
myth of social mobility that we have
Yeah.
is also a myth. When you look at the statistics, the so-called aristocracy,
Yeah.
Aristocrats that aren't really very. Now this is dependent on a military. So if they have to be in a military in order to advance, which was traditionally the way it was, then how well they did in battle, the king would promote the ones that did well, and the ones that didn't were usually dead.
I was about to say, how do
Right.
you show that you've done well in battle?
So there's replacement, and
We have, like, the
and merit.
archetypal
It's
footage.
merit. It's just
I'm about to say that's more of a meritocracy than it is a.
Well, that's, I think, what works out is that all of the different forms of government turn out to still be meritocracies. It's just some of the criteria change
Yeah.
on how, like in a communist country, it's a meritocracy. How big a bully can you be? In an abbey, how well can you argue according to Aristotle's syllogisms? Or how good of an administrator are you, and so on.
That's interesting that's a
Pope-
theory that's related to like the lack of like movement in England is related to.
Yeah, well, that was I think an argument that a lot of folks had before we had really good sociological data tools and things. But we're getting really pretty good at that. I mean, remember we thought of these as the soft sciences because you could come up with all sorts of theories, but you couldn't actually do repetitive experiments,
Yeah.
of course. But the thing is, now we've got data that really kind of replaces that. I mean, you could hone your data, to real,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you've got biochemistry as part of it. You can literally look at the brains of
Yeah.
individuals and see what has effect, what doesn't, and DARPA. I mean, if you think of you're familiar with DARPA. DARPA is a place you could go get work, actually, if you're interested, provided, of course, you have to make sure you can get a clearance, which means no drugs, no arrests, can't kill people you don't like, you know,
Yeah,
or at least not get caught, you know,
There you
that
go.
kind of thing.
Maybe that's one of the qualifications to get to DARPA.
I don't think so. But yeah, there's amazing kinds of things. If you look at this page, I mean, you know, the kind of research they do, manipulating people via the internet, which, remember the Mueller report, you know, just talked about, you know, the various Russian. Now, by the way, just because they're Russian doesn't mean it's the government, a government funded.
You don't think it was the Kremlin trying to?
So it might not, well, I mean, you know, we've had lots of agencies trying to influence voting in other countries, but we can escape the idea that it's the state that's trying to manipulate that by saying that it's a nonprofit agency, right? That's not actually under obligation to government, you know, officials, but instead it's you know the American what was it, America Free Europe, or what was the name of the radio? I mean, there was,
The Clinton Foundation.
well, even that, you know, is officially not a government run. Trump's got his own foundation, etc. So, science. I mean, they can tell how many red sports cars with convertible hoods will be sold in Anchorage next summer, within, give or take, a percentage of like 2 or 3% maybe. Which, considering how many of those will be sold, that's like 2 or 3 cars. You know, if you think, you know, just how accurate some of that. There's a program that you can even buy, although I don't know why you would, and you'd also have to have a Unix server if you were going to use it, but that enables you to analyze sociological behaviors of large groups. It's called swarm technology, because believe it or not, even though you don't think of us as bees, a large group of people behave a lot like bees in the way we you know,
Yeah.
you know, if you collect the data correctly, you can actually predict which way we're going to swarm. You know, we had an interesting presentation on that. Years ago, actually. Kennedy was the one that was here, gave a presentation. I bought his book. It was expensive, but it was really interesting.
Do you make any money off of reviewing books on Amazon? Like, do people
Well, I
pay
don't
you?
do those anymore,
No.
but no, I didn't make money. In fact, it cost me money,
So you have to buy the
and I'll
books.
tell you why. No, I didn't have to buy the books. They sent me 1,000 books or so
Yeah.
for free. Didn't even pay postage. And all I had to do was review the book. The trouble was the government ended up declaring that my receiving those were gifts. And as a result, I had to be given a statement by Amazon reflecting how much the value of the gifts was I received, and I had to pay taxes, income taxes on that.
Gifts? It's not gifts if you have to do homework.
Plus, you know, a lot of the stuff I would have never, of course, bought myself.
They read them off in court, like teen romance, like Vampire
Well,
Diaries.
yeah, this-
Bras! They sent me bras to try on.
Oh, to review, that's
No.
funny.
And
So they were just
yeah,
products too,
and
wasn't just
review.
books.
And I was like, this is a teenage girl's bra, and they sent it to me.
FBI
And I
report.
did a review that says, William Jamison says, this is a very comfortable bra.
Has a picture.
Well, no,
Exhibit.
yeah,
I'm like, who the heck is going to review, read this and think, hey, if Bill liked it, I'm going to have one too.
Oh God.
That's, plus I got some electronic stuff that no one I even know knows what it is. I think you have to live in some sort of Silicon Valley networking institution to have, this
I would just sell
gizmo
it
plugged
today.
in. Worth $400 some or something, and I was like, but what is it? No one knows.
right,
But they canceled that program.
yeah.
That's gone.
That's
Apparently it didn't really promote products very well.
You
And
gotta get a job with Amazon just to do that. It's very hard because you have to have like prior experience testing products.
well, let me, this is our last real session of the semester. We're not really going to summarize the class, of course. Hopefully you get the sense of where we are today. But today's is a session that I was going to use to discuss contemporary European philosophies. We've really done, like with last class, talking about Daniel Dennett as an exemplar of our contemporary philosophers. He was just being promoted on Facebook last night, I guess. But when I clicked on the link to see what it was his book, Intuition Pumps, which is, latest book I remember was Bach, bacteria, 3 B's and back, Bach, bacteria, and back or something, whatever. That was, I think, his latest book. Inside Jokes was another one, but in between those was Intuition Pumps, which is his survey of these giant philosophical leaps that we made from Plato on, the questions that prompted a progressive development in our understanding of ourselves. And those intuition pumps are questions that basically philosophy classes ask students, to gradually move them in the same progressive direction so that eventually, because they can't just tell you, okay, so you thought that this is the way it was, but no, it has to be this way, right? That doesn't work. These have to be uploaded by your asking the question. And that pumps your intuition, you see, so that you come to realize some advanced position yourself. I can't just tell you this. You have to believe this. Instead, you have to come to it yourself, and then you're persuaded, right? Which is, of course, one of the really frustrating experiences people have. When you're arguing with someone who you know to be a Bodo, and you just explain to them the way things work, vaccines do not really, do such and such, we don't really have, huge antennas sitting in Alaska that are, controlling your mind, even though DARPA's trying to do that. They're not using those antennas for it. That's a totally different thing, That was actually communicating with submarines, by the way. That HARP, if you're familiar with it in Alaska, was meant as a test communication system with submarines, which, by the way, no longer works because we now use satellites. So that's completely gone, which is why they sold it. If you're, so it's no longer there, basically. In any case, convincing certain people of things, if you just tell them, hey, this is the right answer, notice that doesn't work. Instead, what, of course, is a time-old tradition of asking them a question. Do the gods love the pious because it's so pious? Or is the pious pious because the gods love it? What? Right? Goes their head. And if they consider it well enough, of course, they begin to have doubt in the religious authority. Because you realize, hey, wait a minute, how do I know that they're in communication with God and God told them what to tell me? Why can't I figure out what's good to do myself, right? Etc. Right? So intuition pumps. So Daniel Dennett, pretty good exemplar of our contemporary American neo-pragmatist or pragmatist point of view, however you want to talk about it. We could also think of ourselves as postmodern, although if you do get into the concept of the postmodern as any other concept, there are, of course, different points of view. And I believe the author of this, Lawler, Peter Augustine Lawler, I believe he's dead. And he wasn't really that old. But postmodernism, rightly understood, I found basically I agreed with what he said. That, of course, doesn't mean that that is what postmodernism is, rightly understood. It just means by thinking that way, you'd be in agreement with Lawler and me and some others. It's a positive approach because the idea of postmodernism, a lot of people argue it's relativity. Well, yeah, it is. The trouble is, usually when they mean that as a critique, it also means that they don't understand the theory of relativity, right? Einstein's theory of relativity is like the physics model that is used at least for some things, right? And that doesn't mean that there is no truth, right? It does mean, however, that you have to look at the specific context. Or the other way of talking about that would be model-dependent realism, which I've emphasized because Stephen Hawking is in vogue, and Mladenov, his co-author in his post-mortem book, maybe it was while he was still alive, but of course Stephen Hawking has passed away. Did you hurt your finger?
This?
Yeah, look.
Birthmark.
Ah, well, that's okay. You're allowed that. I have one too. No.
What?
The wrong part of the
I'm just totally kidding on that. Wasn't going to go there. However, so the interesting thing about postmodernism is it is a theory of relativity associated with complex systems, that when we have complex systems, those complex systems have symbolic concepts that we use in order to frame that model. Within the context of that model, there are truths that are right and wrong in that model. Where the relativity comes into the play here is when you go from one model to another. And the hard part is understanding when we should use which model in order to accomplish the goals that we have. That's hard. I mean, when we talk about human affairs, for example, should we think of a fetus as a person? Or would it be better if we treat the fetus as a virus that the woman can destroy if she likes? Which of those models is going to be better for society overall, right? And you can see that would, of course, be incredibly complex, tying into all sorts of things, the value of human life, the population crisis, who's going to support the child, other social changes, etc. Why do males no longer feel the need to support the female that they mate with, etc. Right? There's all kinds of complex issues with that. So postmodernism, rightly understood, doesn't mean that anything goes, right? It instead means that things are more complex. It's not just black and white. You can't just say, oh, it's always going to be such and such. You have to look at specific context and be, as Kennedy, in talking about swarm intelligence, for example, you have to look at the data, you have to look at how all of the variances play in stochastic events and things of that sort in order to understand the issues. So just saying, oh, you postmoderns, you're relativists, and that's a criticism, is simply a misunderstanding of postmodernism. So we could certainly refer to neo-pragmatists as postmodernists. That makes sense, absolutely. I just realized somebody forgot their device and they're calling themselves on it
You should pick it
to
up.
find out where it is. And it's over here.
You should call them back. Or pick up so then they know.
Do you want to?
Yes.
You know how I don't have a smartphone because I'm not smart enough for one.
Did it send you one on
So-
Amazon? Let's see. Did it send you one on Amazon?
So if you could, well, of course, if you are calling them with their phone, what phone are they receiving the call with?
Well, what call
They must
this?
have just called.
It looks like a text. It looks like they have a lot of notifications, but I'm trying to see what number called them to.
This is a moral dilemma,
I
right?
don't know.
No,
Should we
it's
go
not
into their
moral
phone
at all.
and find
it?
That person forgot their phone.
Okay.
They will come back and find it.
Tiger rolled over to show me his belly.
Oh,
Yeah, and there's nothing. There's no phone number
that
there.
wasn't her husband, was it?
I don't know. If there's no phone number, so when they call back, then we can pick it up. But since they didn't leave a phone number that they called from,
Hey,
call back.
anybody have the program where they can upload like a? No, it's,
We have like a video.
I'll leave it right where it was. They will
I'm sure
they
they'll
will
come back in a
discover
couple
that they don't
minutes.
have it. They will come back and get the phone. No problem. It will be there for them. This is a good campus. People are trustworthy, at least for the most part. Okay, so that said, that we can think of neo-pragmatist as postmodernist, because essentially the difficulty there is the same, recognizing that truth evolves, that truth is dependent on the context. Remember the web of belief by Willard Van Orman Quine. All this beautifully comes together in a coherent way of viewing the world today that is complex. Might even say, along with Stuart Kauffman, who argued that the fourth law of thermodynamics is that everything keeps getting more complex. And even though he was referring to that, I think jokingly, I think nonetheless, that makes sense. I forgot to use the microphone. Is that better? A little bit, sorry. Okay. So moving on to Europe then, Slavoj Žižek is a great example. I know at least Sean, I don't know if any of the others saw the so-called debate, which was really more of a discussion this weekend between Zizek and Peterson. And the main thing I got out of that was Peterson hadn't read very much Zizek, and perhaps hadn't read many other things as well. So it was kind of a surprise
I don't think he's
for
ever
him.
probably read Zizek either, because he was just like,
Yeah, he was unprepared for sure. Like he did not.
So you saw it?
Like yeah, I
Yeah.
watched it
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
Yeah, he didn't like. At least I heard he was talking about the debate before it even happened. He was like, yeah, I wasn't prepared. And he essentially was like, well, I guess if it's about Marxism, we'll just base it off what started Marxism, which was the Communist Manifesto. And so, which is not really smart because Zizek he has his own works, which he should have.
Right, and even though he uses communism as a way of critiquing
yeah.
capitalism, and by the way, one of the papers I got on Zizek, by the way, said that he doesn't like capitalism. Actually, I think I think it's more complex than that. Because capitalism is the way to accomplish things. It's just that there are things wrong with it.
Yeah, like
Zizek would like take money from like people who pay him for the shows that he like to watch.
Although all the
And he would
books,
donate.
all the books that he publishes under what's the
Verso, is it?
Verso, I
Verso
think,
Books, I think?
whatever. That's the money's donated, from what I understand.
He doesn't automatically donate it to whatever charity.
Right, right. I mean, you still have to pay. It's not like you could decide less than nothing should be less than nothing.
I know, right?
You know, you've still got to pay full price for less than nothing.
Yeah,
Although,
I got
beware,
both
you don't
versions,
have
too.
to. It's in the library. You could check it out,
Yeah.
and that works really well. Unless you want to end up like me with a house so full of these damn books that the mice can sit there and gnaw away at night and annoy the heck out of you, and there's no way you can find where they are. At least since the earthquake.
You still
Because
haven't
everything
fixed it?
I'm waiting still for the weather to be warm enough for me to be able to open the garage door
Oh, yeah,
and see everything fall out. You know, it's going to be like a tidal wave of books, you know, pouring out of my garage. And I know once that happens, it's going to take me a couple of days to get everything
Oh, yeah.
sorted. And, you know, it's not like I can take my sorting hat and just Gryffindor. You know, I have to, you know, figure out. Well, this one's a tall red one. This one's a small green one. Okay, I have to show you this. This is fun. This is the two Ronnies. Have you ever listened to them? Library.
Yeah,
They actually do
you posted
several.
about this and I watched it. It was hilarious.
I posted this.
Yeah, weeks ago. I wanted to watch it. It was hilarious.
Well, that's
no
interesting.
sound.
No sound. And I don't see why.
Is it muted on the computer?
Yeah.
What?
Well, maybe I can help you. So what book exactly did you want to? Well, it's called The Twisted Spur by E.M. Haggerty. Right, Haggerty. Haggerty. Hennessy, Tennessee. Haggerty. There he is, Haggerty. Spur Twisted Thee. Haggerty, E.M. It's a green book. Right there with all the green books. But there are thousands of green books there. I mean, oh, well, naturally they are subdivided. Oh, good. All the big books are on the bottom, all the little books are on the top. All the big books on the bottom, the little books on the top. Yes, what are you, a little one or a big one? You're not being very helpful, are you, sir? I'm not being very helpful. How are we supposed to find books if you file them like that? Well, I've never had any trouble. Only this very morning I found just the book I wanted, just like that. What was that? A big red one. No, I'm not interested in the size or the colour. Well, fortunately, upstairs we have duplicates of all these books that are down here, all up on the second floor. Not classified by size and colour. Not classified by size or colour. Ah, good. Then perhaps you can tell me where, on the second floor, I can find the Twisted Spur. Right. E.M. Haggerty? Western, is it? Yes, it is. Is it a thick Western or a thin Western? Well, I don't know, do I? All the thin Westerns are on the right-hand side of upstairs. I don't believe this. Thick, green, thin, thick. I mean, it's balmy. Balmy? Is that E.M. Balmy or WHO? Your system is stupid. What, no one else has ever complained. Well, I'm complaining. Will you please finally tell me where I can find a copy of The Twisted Spur by E.M. Haggerty? Oh, hello, Mrs. Bonnet. How how did you enjoy your book then?
Oh, it was fantastic. The most wonderful love story I've ever read. Oh, they were so passionate. I mean, every time they met, ooh, and she was all, ooh. I mean, and like always, I mean, cool.
Yeah,
It's great.
he's good.
That's great.
He's good.
Even though that library system is ridiculous, it's better than my current system at home. Because I don't even have them organized by size or color.
Stacked up, just on the floor.
Last night, Donna asked for a grapefruit soda of, a particular kind that she buys as a case from Amazon because it meets her strict requirements. But the case, of course, is sitting out in the garage, and she asked for one, and I went out, and of course I had 15 books stacked on that box. So I had to take all those books and put them on my chair so that I could open the box and get one soda out for her. So yeah, so once finals are over, I've got my house to work on.
If you ever get trapped in your house, you won't be bored.
If I ever.
Like get trapped in your house, like zombie apocalypse.
Oh yeah, well I worry, because my wife and I are both getting old, and eventually we're going to need like an occasional wheelchair use, and there's no place, the wheelchair will end its utility at the door, there's no using the wheelchair in the house, right, at this point. So we'll see. And yet
Pretty bad.
some of the rooms and things were designed for wheelchair because for years we took care of Grandpa, and he was wheelchair bound for quite some time. However, let me get to what we're actually supposed to talk about today. Slavoj Žižek. Well, so of course some of you are familiar with Slavoj Žižek. For those of you who are not, get with it. Start watching his stuff. And you might think, like Noam Chomsky says, that he's
Crazy.
absolutely ridiculous,
Yes.
makes no point,
Yeah.
etc. But notice when
It's
you
outrageous.
listen to Slavoj Žižek talk about Noam Chomsky, he's kind of like, oh, yes, well, I understand where Noam is coming from, The trouble is, of course, Noam is not able to understand where Slavoj is coming from. And part of the problem is, following Hegel, a certain change took place in the vocabulary of the European philosophy community. Existentialism is loaded with it. Nietzsche is a perfect example of it. Heidegger is absolutely a great example of this. But of course, all of the French contemporaries talk this way. That's why, for example, when oh my goodness, help me, Derrida, who was considered by the French to be a fantastic philosopher, was invited to give the keynote speech for the American Philosophical Association East Coast for a particular presentation. That was, of course, years ago before he died and so on. And there was hell to pay among the membership because quite a few members were absolutely convinced that he was not a philosopher at all. He spoke, as Noam Chomsky would say of Zizek, he spoke nonsense. He was contradicting himself, speaking sentences that didn't make any sense, etc. So where did that rift come from? Well, the rift, of course, is a result of the analytic tradition in the East. I mean, not the East, but Britain, and mostly the East Coast of the U.S. and the West Coast. It really, it's the coasty thing, where we still see that conflict, red state, blue state stuff. All the blue votes are on the coast for the most part. That's also the analytic tradition's locale. But when you look at what they were trying to do, it was a good tradition. It was really an important development in England, in the United States, because it forces individuals to be much more aware of the meaning of what they are saying, how ambiguous things can be, so that you have to understand very, very specifically what's being communicated. And one of the things that precipitated out of this is computer code. So if you think, the symbolic languages that we use, we have obviously loaded on these devices, which communicate very, very clearly. If you think about it, no laptop sending a file to the other computer, is sending the file over, and the laptop looks at it and says, "I'm looking at your file and I don't get it. I don't think, laptops don't have that problem." Humans have that problem. I might say something and you look at me, "What do you mean?" Like, for example, last night, one of our friends, we were talking about the 20 candidates for the Democratic Party. And one of the members of the table said, with regard to one of the senators that's running, and he says, "Oh, I don't think she has a chance. She's too flat." And of course, it's a table full of men. Immediately, we began criticizing whether or not she was too flat or not. And that was funny, and it became hilarious because, of course, Bob was talking about her way of speaking was flat, not very energetic. But what we were all joking about was, of course,
Trying to get the tea.
a reference to her physical characteristics, right? Which was just it was a way of laughing at Bob. It wasn't like it would really influence the way anyone would vote, I hope, for a particular candidate. But what were we doing? We were pointing out the ambiguity of his using the term flat with regard to a particular senator who's a candidate. But I mean, we all knew what we were doing. I mean, that's that's fun. That's called humor, etc. And it's helped by wine. Let's face it, at a table. In any case, that understanding of the characteristic of language is something that the British and American university systems are very much aware of. And that's a very important thing. And students really need to be aware of that. So it's actually a loss for European students to not have that opportunity to do that kind of analytic analysis of the language that they're using, right? Remember, Quine gives us lines like, "All translation is a lie." So that the challenge to getting it right, to understanding what a person is saying so that you can translate it appropriately, really improves with your recognition that translation is an art, and that you're not actually giving a word-for-word translation, and that in fact a word-for-word translation from one language to another wouldn't do it. There's other nuances there that are important. I think I mentioned Douglas Hofstadter's book, Le Tombeau de Marat, or Marat, however I would think it would be Marot, but if you speak French, how would you say that? Well, T on the end is usually silent. Cabaret, for example, you don't say cabaret, right? Even in English, right? But so in praise of the music of language. If I hadn't explained it before, notice this poem on the cross is basically a get well card, which obviously didn't work because it's on the tomb stone, right? But on seeing it, he decided to translate that from the French into English, and he did. And he thought, well, what about this way? And he translated again, did it maybe 4 or 5 times. Then got the idea of emailing his friends, including Vladimir Nabokov, by the way. So he emailed his friends and asked them to do their translation of the poem, and he gathered the book with, I forget how many poems, translations of the very simple poem, and then, of course, put this together in a book where you could see all of the different accurate but completely incompatible translations of this same poem, right? And of course, this leads to a discussion in the book about the nature of language, etc. But so, Quine today seems absolutely right in saying that translation is a lie, in the sense, oh, what does he mean by that, right? Well, we have to translate what he means by that. But you recognize the complexity of this process, right? And yet that's pragmatism. It's also postmodernism. And that's also the difficulty that the Europeans have. And Zizek is a sterling example of this, that he'll be speaking about something and can disagree with himself. He could say something and then apparently disagree with himself. I remember once someone said to him, you're contradicting yourself. And he says, of course I'm contradicting myself. I speak too fast not to contradict myself, right? So he's not pausing from one mode to another to explain alternative ways of imagining a context for something specific, right? And where does this come from? Well, if you think of the nature of thought from Hegel on, what we've got is the organic model, right? Where it's not clear at what point the acorn becomes an oak tree, all the way through to the point where the oak tree is now collapsed and is rotten and feeding the forest, right? So in the entire range from an acorn to the little sapling, to the huge oak tree until it's lumber, right? Basically, it's an oak tree, and yet that doesn't give us a clear sense of exactly what on earth we're talking about when we say oak tree. And if you apply that one model to all nouns, you realize that we have a sense of family resemblance, but that's even ambiguous. That's a nice way of talking about it. I see the family resemblance. All 14 of your children clearly look something like you and your wife, and they all look like one another. Okay, I can see it, but can I actually describe it? Well, by the way, I used to not be able to describe it, but now we have computer algorithms that can look at your face and do an incredible, superhuman, detailed analysis of the shape of the face, so that literally airports can have cameras that watch approaching travelers and can match those faces to a database of suspected terrorists or terrorist families. So relatives of terrorists, for example, can be identified, etc. So if you think about it, Sean, were you going to say something about that? No? But if you think about it, that's impressive. And that means that Wittgenstein's comment about family resemblance, which is where that comes from, essentially is being superseded by the ability of cameras and computers to actually recognize individuals within really strong parameters. Yes?
Do you think that's an unlawful, search and seizure to, take someone's photograph?
Technology goes faster than Congress's ability to legalize what happens.
They've actually bypassed it with technology. That's how they've done it.
Really?
Yeah.
Right.
So it reminds
Yeah.
me of the
Every
23
camera that we have on camera.
Facebook is going to have to spend $4 billion in penalty fees for its
Oh, with people's pictures, like their private pictures?
apparently, and the thing, the odd thing was, in announcing that, their stock price went up. Which you would have thought would have been just the opposite. But instead it went up because, oh, yeah, well, they're dealing with it, right? So it's...
It's the hidden fees of the different programs that the cameras are using. that
Yeah,
make
yeah.
the stock goes up, because there's like government systems within DARPA that
Uh-huh.
control it, and that's how, yeah.
But so now, I mean, that's an excellent question. Is that something that should be illegal? Well, what happens like that is always, it's after the fact that Congress sits down and says, what should we do with, with this?
Right.
For example, I remember years ago, it was during the Bush administration, right, that stem cell technology had just started. They realized the power of stem cells, but the stem cells that they had available for study in laboratories came from like 25 fetuses that had been aborted. So they had a limited number of lines that came from these fetuses, but that obviously the medical system was going to continue to harvest fetuses, and as a result, especially the religious communities were up in arms, because this is using murdered children as scientific experiments, etc. And so Congress was like, wow, this is scary, we better do something. So they all gathered and they started trying to, and it was hilarious because, of course, none of the representatives trying to deal with it had the education, the scientific education to understand what the heck they were talking about. So it was a major effort for them to try to learn what it was, to discuss with various counselors on what kind of laws might be required. They ended up coming to a conclusion that what they would do is say, okay, it's legal, provided you only use the limited lines of stem cells that are already there. In other words, you can't use more fetuses and harvest them in order to have more stem cell lines. You can only use the ones that are already in the laboratories, etc. Well, guess what? By the time that even got to the floor of the Senate, scientists responded, oh, by the way, you could forget that whole legislation. We've now realized we can harvest stem cells from the individual himself, because we all have them, and so you don't have to just take them from a fetus, which is, of course, loaded with them. But then there were accompanying problems, because if you're using the stem cells from a fetus and trying to inject them into a person who needs an improved kidney or something, right? The DNA doesn't match that individual, and it will be rejected and cause all kinds of problems for the individual receiving the DNA. And by the way, today is DNA Day, from what I understand. But it's celebration of when DNA was first recognized. Let me see here. How come Google doesn't say anything about DNA Day? Oh, there's deals out there.
Oh my God.
National DNA Day.
So
This
they
is-
could also seize our DNA.
Yeah, there's specials. So if you want to go and have your DNA test done, it's on sale today.
They're gonna sell it.
Yeah, they are. They are.
That's
They're going to
horrific.
sell it. Because once your DNA is in their database, of course, you know that they're going to sell that.
Even a family member's DNA, they can use it to find you, which is horrifying. What was that one movie where it was like everybody had another person who was like the person that they would harvest
Surrogate?
their organs?
Oh,
I think, yeah.
The Island?
Jude Law. Yeah.
Oh,
Wait, who is it? Like,
wait a second.
there was one called The Island, wasn't it?
I know that one. Yeah. That's the one that were underground, and
I'm trying
that
to
was
remember.
with
And there's like a really there's like a
Drake.
hot girl and she escapes. I'm trying to remember.
Jessica Biel.
And they have Oh, maybe. They have like an elevator. And there's like a video of the elevator. I watched it years and years ago, but I feel like we're heading towards that.
Well, I mean, yeah, now they know that you have stem cells in your own body that we're actually replacing cells all the time. And they start out as stem cells and move to the locations. Amazing, all this stuff. Even the brain. I remember as a kid, and you banged your head on something, Mom would say, "Don't you hurt your head. You only get one brain, and you kill your cells and they won't grow again." And that's wrong, actually. You have replacement brain cells. As long as you've got enough telomeres on the ends of your chromosomes, telomeres on your end of chromosomes, you roughly get 50 approximately, and so each cell replaces itself once every 2 years on average, you end up with 100 years. So roughly our life expectancy could be 100 years. Obviously, we've got some who made it to 120 who still drink alcohol and smoke cigars. And are really old, ugly ladies, if you've seen those pictures, but hey, 120 years old. What was the latest one? 119 something? Amazing. However. So, yeah, Congress, by the time Congress gets a hold of what's going on in science, they're too far behind to deal with it. And I don't know what happened to that law because science had just progressed on, and the law ended up being totally unimportant at that point. But so, let me, since you're familiar with Slavoj, let me move on to Elaine Badiou. I've actually got my own notes here because I was talking about these notes I made in response to a series of presentations that the philosophy department gave one another a few years ago. And part of it is because we enjoy learning, and we enjoy learning things in philosophy. And since we're all doing our own research, what we all agreed would be a good idea is for us to spend some time sharing with one another what our current research was teaching us. So we did, in fact, have a session where we spent a whole Saturday sharing with one another. And this was my presentation that I made up, which was especially in response to one of the other presentations on Heidegger. And I liked it. It was a neat way of putting everything together where I could mention these Europeans, not all European, but Elaine Badiou, definitely. Philip Kitcher, who I've neglected talking about Philip Kitcher, but I should mention Philip Kitcher. He's got lots of interesting books. He's rather difficult, but he is, of course, a British philosopher that spent his career in the United States. But one of his books is on mathematics, the nature of mathematical knowledge, for example, is the title. Let's see, here, I could go to his page. He is another philosopher that talks about Darwin. This is a book written for a popular audience. Let's see. Why am I not able to see some of his other books? But this one, Science in a Democratic Society. Basically, his argument here is that in a democracy, when you're looking at a pyramid with the majority of people at the bottom of the pyramid, and they vote, and they don't understand what they're talking about. So what you need to do is have peers, scientific peers, that basically offer the kinds of choices that the democracy can vote on. So you're not having folks that don't understand what they're talking about just voting on stuff and not coming to absolutely ridiculous, results. But instead, if you have the scientific community present, okay, you could either do this or this, nothing else makes sense, and then the people vote on which way to go. That's his attempted basic solution to the kinds of problems we have in,
It sounds a lot like a republic almost, but I guess if it's the scientific community, it's not.
Oh, absolutely.
A republic is just like
excellent,
educated officials.
excellent way of looking at it, right?
Why the scientific community though?
Well, in this particular book, he's talking about things like stem cells.
Wait, when was this written?
2011.
Oh, I thought this was older because of the title and the. I thought this was like a
Oh, Philip
reprint
Kitcher's
of a-
another lie. I believe he's in my list, actually,
Oh,
of people that you could do your paper on. Science, Truth, and Democracy. This one, Finding an Ending. This is about Wagner's Ring Cycle, which is interesting. But this one, The Nature of Mathematical Knowledge, this is 83. But in this book, it was rather startling because he applied the evolutionary theory to mathematics. And normally when we talk about mathematics, we think of mathematics as sort of immune to evolution, because you think, hey, 2 + 2 = 4. It was always the case. But actually, when you look at the history of math, there is an evolutionary progress to it. And so basically, you could argue, the book argues against the view that mathematical knowledge is a priori. In other words, you can't come up with mathematical formulas by just sitting in your armchair and mathematizing. We do need kind of the gradual experiential development that is true in all other human endeavors, etc. So he's cool as well. So I say this is a point made by Philip Kitcher in his recent work where he suggests that more of the decisions made by a democratic society need to be made by specialists who actually know and understand the facts. In short, math, again, should rule, at least in some places and situations. But Alain Badiou, who's in his 80s and a French philosopher, and absolutely dumping books on us like crazy. He's one of those authors where the more you read, the more there is to read. It's a deluge.
And there's an actual film that's out and you can eventually watch. I think my friend Jaden said that the movie will come to the United States like in winter.
This winter, with Alain Badiou as the.
Yeah, it's a biography.
Boy, that's going to be an immense hit. Not.
It's right now going through the film festival, and yeah, it's crazy.
Who's this? That's not him.
Oh, it's an interview.
Good music. Is this an ad? No, this is. The Guardians.
Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. Merci d'être au rendez-vous des Sentinelles. Notre invité ce soir est l'un des plus grands philosophes philosophe actuel. Il est aussi auteur,
He's
dramaturge
one
et
of our
professeur
living
émérite de l'École normale
important
supérieure.
philosophers.
Alain Badiou est l'auteur d'une philosophie de
teaches
l'être
at
et de
the,
l'événement, féru de
well, they
mathématiques,
call normal
adepte de
superior.
Platon et ardent défenseur de l'hypothèse communiste. C'est aussi un homme passionné de théâtre
Talks about-
depuis
he's another
l'adolescence, engagé
communist.
depuis mai 68, et on lui doit un éloge de
Reference
l'amour
to
au
the
succès
68
retentissant.
revolution.
Bonsoir Alain
Well,
Badiou.
it wasn't a revolution.
Merci d'être avec nous.
Et je suis content d'y être.
Nous également. On avait envie, si vous le
It's all
permettez,
the
d'ouvrir
same,
cette
également,
émission avec un
right?
thème qui fait la une de
My
l'actualité en
French
ce moment.
is très
Difficile
horrible,
d'y
by the
échapper.
way.
On célèbre les 50 ans de mai 68. On reviendra dans un instant à votre dernier ouvrage, évidemment, à ce
Your
sujet.
last
Mais
work,
on
dernier
avait envie d'abord de vous
ouvrage,
resituer,
your
vous, par
last work.
rapport aux événements. À l'époque, vous avez 30 ans. Que faisiez-vous et
30
comment
years.
avez-vous perçu mai 68 avec
So,
vos yeux de
you don't want
l'époque?
me to try to translate.
Écoutez, à cette époque, j'étais
But so, yeah, so there, and obviously speaking French, it's interesting. This is what Facebook, not Facebook, YouTube thinks I would be interested in. And some of this just does not good. Raising children. Oh, that's Jeff Foxworthy. Didn't I play some of Jeff Foxworthy? Monty Python. Hey, by the way, notice no pornography. So you see, I only look at good stuff. So here's Badiou on Heidegger, is it? It sounds vaguely Wagnerian, doesn't it? But it isn't. The most suspect of three.
Vous êtes venu annoncer comme un à suivre le plus suspect des trois. J'ai précisé, il y avait des doutes sur cette histoire de suspicion. J'ai précisé, d'après ce que j'ai compris, je ne me suis pas complètement trompé sur le type.
C'est-à-dire, en réalité, à la fin des fins, avec Parménide, primordial.
So obviously, I'm just finding French ones, but he does speak English in some.
Professeur de...
But we don't need to do that. Instead, let me talk about his books. His main works, I mean, a lot of them are huge, but the being an event is kind of his main work, just like Zizek's is Less Than Nothing. And I would actually tie them all together. If you think of the chain, that's part of what I had. My notes really are a reference to this chain of influence. With Hegel, we can go back to his logic, which describes the very, very beginning of things as being, and then out of being comes its antithesis, which is nothing. So you've got the concept of being and nothingness in its dialectical process, and from there, everything comes about, right? His logic is Hegel's book, but when you look at people like Heidegger, Heidegger talks about being and time. Sein und Zeit is Heidegger's big book, right? Which, by the way, turns out to be only volume 1. He was supposed to have a volume 2, which he never did. Then we have Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, reacting to Heidegger, and his book is L'être et le néant, or Being and Nothingness. Notice there's a pattern, of course. Being is almost always going to take, a part of it. although when you think of Thomas Metzinger, it's being no one. It's his book, big book, right? You know, being no one, etc. But you can see this kind of pattern. And for Alain Badiou, it's logic of worlds. And what he really tries to do is give us a sense that so being an event and logic of worlds are the two volumes of the one work. And basically he argues that today we've advanced to the point where what we mean by things is mathematics, or mathematical descriptions of these things. And so keeping in mind Quine's predicate logic, it's not just Quine's predicate logic, but predicate logic where, remember, things do not exist per se, but instead they are actions. They're complex systems in an arrangement. So while we use language and we are forced by language to think of things as objects, nouns, what we mean by the nouns are sets that we apply then to the variables that we think of as containing or having the predicates. So it's predicate logic. And so the predicates are the actions that the sets are doing, right? So and in Alain Badiou, those sets are defined by their mathematical nature, algorithms. So this algorithm interacting with this algorithm, etc. So everything is essentially a mathematical algorithm in relationship to other mathematical algorithms, and it all is dependent on the level of context where we're talking. So the same camera can be at one level particles, at another level software, at another level a physical object, at another level a privacy irritant of some sort, right, etc. Right. So it is what it is, but you have to also add in the linguistic context that you're talking about. And that's what the Europeans muddle. You know, the Europeans play games with that. They love it. In fact, you know, you could spend a couple of years learning how to play that game. As far as Noam Chomsky is concerned, you've just totally wasted away your life for a couple of years. And in fact, worse than that, because now you're going to be infected with all of this stuff. So you're going to come out of there and spew nonsense yourself, because you've wasted these years learning how other philosophers have spewed nonsense to the point where you've been able to pick up this nonsense spewing characteristic yourself. And you're a waste of time. No one wants to listen to you. Well, that's not true. In Europe, of course, they love it. It's entertaining. Zizek has a huge fan base. And it's spreading to the United States too, right? You know, I don't think it has actually spread much to Anchorage, you know. But nonetheless, I think if I'm a fan now. If we got him coming to UAA to speak, you know, oh, Slavoj Zizek here in Anchorage, you know, we'd have 20 people would show up for the, you know.
It'd still be awesome.
I'm just guessing. You know, who knows? Maybe they'd come out of the woodwork, but you know, I think it would be kind of silly.
I think you told me that if he were to come out to UAA, they would have to pay his flight and hotel.
That's what we typically do, yes.
Yeah, but that's what he said to me. So I was like, yeah, I would do it, but.
Oh yeah, well the ones that we do have come, we pay their way. We did, in fact, have a speaker this year from Wisconsin, I think he was. And we paid his way in the hotel and all that stuff. And we had a room of about 30 people. So, you know, that's pretty clear to me that that kind of thing is going to go away. That'll be one of the things UAA will have to cut. They've already said they're cutting travel, et cetera, because of the budget. But so being an event ties in beautifully to this. I'm going to end the discussion here, not because there isn't lots more fun stuff to talk about. There's some really fascinating Europeans. Notice even the British play games with language, of course. But if you get a chance, please notice this is my little this is the very first YouTube video I ever made. This is a training video, how to study Hegel.
Just sit there reading that post.
There is some action in this. If you look at my foot, you'll notice that I wiggle it. Right about here.
Oh my god. It was so action-packed.
But, and by the way, I was reading Hegel's logic in this video.
You can't see all the Amazon memorabilia stocked up in the background. It's all just pushed out and frame, but it like tumbles in the video end.
The camera's actually stacked on top of all
There
the
we
books.
go.
Yeah.
That's wrong. To a tripod.
Oh, this was years ago. We hadn't had the earthquake at this point. So, but I did have that fireplace. So that's.
Did all
by
your
the
bookshelves
way,
break?
what's funny is I had.
Like, because one of my bookshelves broke, I was really sad from the earthquake.
In response to this, when I made this video, there was a video response by this person. Let's see if it's still there.
You made a friend.
Is it how to study Nietzsche?
So this is a friend who made his video, Gedanken zu Friedrich Nietzsche.
Do you guys still hang out?
I don't really know this person, but there he is.
Like thinking about Nietzsche.
He's thinking about Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was like, wait a minute, that sounds too familiar.
Sit
Or
and stand.
And actually, I've had quite a lot of responses to this. Some were critiques,
Serious?
saying, I doubt that you're actually studying Hegel,
Ooh.
stuff like that. Yeah, it's just hilarious.
Well,
You're getting.
And they were in lots of different languages too. Lots of different languages. Greek, with some Greek comments, you know. But,
That's too good.
and he did a 5 minute. I only did 2.5 because this was my very first video, and I knew that they were only going to limit me to like 2 minutes. And it took actually a while before I got to the point where I could put a whole lecture up on YouTube without, you know, overstepping my allowance. I have no clue how on earth YouTube could do it.
Just sitting there.
Storage must be so cheap. Well, I could put hours worth of this kind of stuff where you're basically staring at the handprints on the end of the counter here. Sorry about that. I try to put it propped up so that you can actually see my exciting features.
At least this does not mean eating. Like last semester. Remember last semester?
Oh, yes,
we were
yes.
eating, had either like a burrito or a salad, and then it was like everything else would go out of focus, and it would just be me eating. It was like ASMR. but
Thank
not
goodness
in
you
a
didn't
way.
complain and call it a FERPA violation. I wouldn't be here, you know.
That's
But-
funny.
So this is fun. This is fun.
Do you have a quiz question?
I do. Of all the quiz questions I've asked so far this semester, which was your favorite?
Can we say that this quiz question
certainly can. That's
I called it including the food.
yeah, that's recursion, and that's perfectly acceptable. That gets you into the theory of types. If you remember Bertrand Russell's attempt to solve the problem of recursion when he was faced with Gödel's critique of his theory, which ended up with him basically giving up on his attempt.
And what time are we meeting next week?
Good question. Let me go back to the syllabus because I did quadruple check to make sure that I had the right thing. And I believe it's Tuesday at regular time. Tuesday from 1 o'clock to 3:45. And I will bring movies that we can discuss. Remember, it's not mandatory. So if you have a conflict, don't feel stressed because I'm still trying to win your friendship and make you like me so that you recommend taking my classes, if I ever have any, to other people so that I can actually have enough students for the class to run.
My friend Sky's taking it.
Yes. Thank you. Because otherwise my wife won't get any more money.
You won't get any more Amazon products.
Yeah.
Oh, that's,
All the
yeah.
video endorsements.
Shoot.
When's the last moment where we can submit our return paper?
Excellent question, Jude. Thank you.
Okay, so
Literal last moment.
Yeah, like minute.
1
Second.
millisecond before.
So the final week ends like Saturday or Sunday of this week, which is April 30th, right? And of that week, which actually goes into May, I believe, right? Because this is Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
And then grades are usually due on Wednesday, midnight, the following week.
The following week.
Yeah.
The following week. But keep in mind that I go out drinking with the guys on Wednesday night, and I finish before I go. So
You should definitely grade my drinking. After you've gone drinking, it might make it go down a little better.
you'd have me replying with comments like, "I think this paragraph is a little flat," and you'll be wondering, "What does he mean by flat?" You know,
Rewrite it.
A little flat. Yes.
Yeah, it came in. Sometimes the font gets scrunched, you know. And don't send me pages, please. Some folks still are sending me pages files.
Oh, not
And
in PDF.
not a single computer I have will open pages files.
That's actually a pretty smart trick.
Well, I email them back and say, no grade for you, you know, unless you...
Never mind.
Yeah, I was gonna say like I did.
I need to actually, like, you know, have the paper.
I did it just
Oh, you don't have a program to convert pages to like different.
Remember, I'm not very smart, so I'm a PC kind of person. Thanks for taking all my courses. I think she took all 4 of the ones that I do. So.
Wow. I think she said she didn't take logic.
She didn't take that could be.
Yeah. Because I think she wanted to take it in the summer.
Yeah.
Well, I am doing logic this summer. I have, I think, 15 people signed up for it.
Already. Sweet.
Well, I didn't check. I can check real quick.
See, for me, I'm all done with all I gotta do is take ethics. That's one of the 4.
Was saying
All I have to take is ethics.
like the flat just philosophy of ethics.
No, it's not the philosophy of ethics. It's called ethics because ethics is a whole section of philosophy.
Oh,
overall.
yeah. Well, there's professional ethics, business ethics. Like there's all
Oh,
these
yeah,
different.
no,
Like what I meant by plain ethics was that
Yeah,
class.
'cause
Because I had to take that one as well.
Because in the core classes, you get the history classes,
Yep.
logic, intro, and ethics.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping to get a C in my
Yes, so I have 15 so far.
Oh, intro to philosophy?
So, because this fall, I'm trying to take ethics, because she wants writing 211.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I'm not gonna try to go for other philosophy.
I put that, I like that.
Yeah.
So
no.
I have 15 in my logic class for the summer, and it meets
24.
Monday evenings from 5:30 to 9:55. I'm thinking it'll be at Chugiak High School.
Yeah, I was like, wait, but Equinoverse is not gonna.
I think that's what they decided, is that they're gonna try to keep them in the same location, but they might have to split it. Yeah, because I'm taking an introduction to logic and reasoning online.